The Fall of Berlin, the final battle of WWII in Europe. The City of Shadows. Berlin, April 1945. The city that had once stood as the iron heart of the thousand-year Reich was now nothing more than a fractured skeleton of smoke, rubble, and fear. Every sunrise brought only more destruction, every sunset another tally of the dead. The ground trembled day and night, sometimes from artillery, sometimes from the whispered dread of those trapped inside the dying capital. Buildings groaned under the weight of ruin while the sky burned red from perpetual bombardment. Berlin smelled of dust, fire, and hopelessness. Inside a half-collapsed apartment block, 14-year-old Erich Vogel, wrapped in a soot-covered blanket, listened to the thunder of Soviet guns growing closer. He held a Luftwaffe helmet far too big for his head, a gift from a panicked Volkssturm officer who had marched boys like him into the front just weeks earlier. Now, even the officers were gone. Erich's mother rested against the cold wall, her face pale from hunger. She whispered, "The Red Army, they are almost here." Every citizen knew it. The posters still clinging to walls insisted that Berlin will never fall, that the Führer has a plan, that victory is certain. But the propaganda meant nothing now. The artillery spoke louder. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the ruins, behind meters of concrete in the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler still promised final victory. His generals argued, maps spread out like the dying veins of the Reich. His voice trembled not with fear, but with delusion. Above ground, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov prepared the final strike. To the north, Konstantin Rokossovsky tightened the noose. To the south, Ivan Konev raced toward the city, determined not to be outdone. Three titans of the Red Army converged on one objective, Berlin. The final prize, the final vengeance, the final blow of a 6-year nightmare. Millions had already died for this moment. Millions more prayed that it would end. But Berlin would not die quietly. As Soviet shells screamed overhead like metallic banshees and the sky lit up with unnatural light, the world held its breath. The final battle in Europe had begun. Chapter 1. The Ring of Fire. The assault began on April 16, 1945. At exactly 3:00 a.m., on the Seelow Heights east of Berlin, 900,000 Soviet soldiers prepared for the most important offensive of the war. Floodlights. Thousands of them flickered to life, turning night to day. Searchlights stabbed the darkness to blind the German defenders. The roar of 40,000 artillery guns erupted simultaneously in a sound so powerful that veterans later swore the earth itself cracked open. It was the loudest artillery barrage in human history. Private Alexei Morozov, a 22-year-old from Stalingrad, tightened his grip on his Mosin Nagant rifle as the ground vibrated violently beneath him. He had survived Kursk. He had survived the frozen hell of 42. And now he stood on the brink of the enemy's lair. He whispered a prayer under his breath, not for victory, but for mercy. Beside him, his commander, Captain Leonid Kirov, shouted over the pandemonium, "Forward, comrades, for every village they burned, for every family they took from us. Berlin is the end of it all." Alexei inhaled sharply. He knew why he was here, why every man in the Red Army marched with such grim determination. They had seen what the Germans had done in the East. Entire towns wiped out, civilians slaughtered, children starving. Berlin was not just a military objective. Berlin was justice. The Soviet infantry surged forward, but resistance was fierce. German defenders, a desperate mix of Wehrmacht veterans, SS diehards, Volkssturm boys, and old men, fought like cornered wolves. Machine guns tore through the fog. Tanks exploded into fireballs. Bodies fell in waves. Alexei crawled behind a shattered tree stump as bullets zipped past him. Ahead, the Seelow Heights loomed like a wall of iron. "Captain," Alexei shouted, "their positions are fortified. We need armor." "We are the armor," Kirov roared, pointing toward the T-34s rolling forward, cannons blazing. The heights were littered with mines, anti-tank traps, and makeshift barricades. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they defended more than a city. They defended the illusion of survival. By midday, the battlefield had turned to mud and blood. But slowly, agonizingly, the Soviets broke through. The Seelow Heights fell on April 19th. Nothing stood between the Red Army and Berlin now. As the sun set over the smoking fields, Alexei looked westward. In the distance, beyond the orange haze, he could almost see the silhouette of the Reichstag. "Soon," he whispered, "soon it ends." Chapter 2. Inside. The Dying Capital. Berlin was collapsing, but inside the Führer bunker, reality had long since lost its meaning. Hitler, pale and trembling, stared at the situation maps with sunken eyes. The lines marking Soviet positions moved closer each hour. Berlin was surrounded. No reinforcements were coming. His armies existed only on paper, divisions that were destroyed yet still ordered to counterattack. General Krebs spoke cautiously. "My Führer, Steiner cannot launch the offensive. He has no men." Hitler's face contorted with rage. "No! Steiner will attack! He must!" There was silence. Even the air seemed to recoil. Meanwhile, outside the bunker, Berlin's defenders prepared for house-to-house fighting. SS brigades fortified government buildings. Volkssturm teenagers were issued single-shot Panzerfausts and told to aim for Soviet tanks. Erich Vogel watched from a shattered balcony as his neighborhood turned into a war zone. Soldiers dug trenches across streets. Civilians carried water in buckets. Bodies lay uncollected along sidewalks. Above them, the sky pulsed with the glow of artillery fire. A neighbor, old Frau Dietrich, whispered, "This city is cursed. Why must children die for a madman?" Erich didn't answer. He simply clutched the too large helmet to his chest. That night, as air raids shook their apartment, he crawled to his mother's side. "Will we survive this?" His mother stroked his hair gently, though her own eyes were heavy with despair. "I don't know, Erich, but no matter what happens, stay with me." Outside, the Soviets tightened the ring. The fall of Berlin had truly begun. Chapter 3. The Red Tide Floods. The capital, on April 23rd, the sky over Berlin glowed a deep, hellish red. Not from sunset, there had been no sunset visible in weeks, but from the fires devouring block after block as Soviet artillery tore the capital apart. The thunder was constant, like the heartbeat of some monstrous beast drawing closer with every passing minute. Private Alexei Morozov stood atop a destroyed tram as Soviet infantry poured into the eastern districts. The column stretched endlessly behind him, tanks, trucks, exhausted soldiers marching through streets lined with ruins. What had once been working-class neighborhoods were now tangled skeletons of brick and steel. Yet, for all the devastation, resistance only grew fiercer as they advanced deeper into the city. Captain Kirov barked, "Keep your heads low. The Germans fight hardest when their backs are against the wall." His words were immediately confirmed. A Panther tank hidden behind a toppled building opened fire, obliterating a T-34 at the column's front. Flames shot into the sky. Soviet infantry scattered for cover. "AT crews, forward!" Kirov shouted. Alexei sprinted behind a wrecked bus, the smell of burning fuel choking him. To his left, two German youths, maybe 15, maybe 16, appeared at a window with Panzerfausts. Their hands trembled. Their uniforms were mismatched scraps, but their expressions were deadly serious. Alexei froze. They were his enemies, yet they were still children. A Soviet machine gunner opened fire before the boys could launch their weapons. The window erupted into shards of glass. The Panzerfaust fell into the street with a metallic clatter. Alexei turned away, jaw tight. He had seen much during the war, but this city of children forced into suicide missions, felt like the darkest thing of all. Far ahead, the Panther's turret turned toward another Soviet tank. "Load armor-piercing," someone shouted. A T-34 roared forward from a side street, its cannon firing point blank. The Panther exploded in a violent orange blossom. The ground shook as its turret flew into the air like a discarded toy. Soviet troops cheered. The advance surged on. For the Germans in Berlin, however, these victories of the Red Army meant something far different. They meant the noose was tightening. In the city center, Erich Vogel followed his mother through the shattered remains of Alexanderplatz. They were among thousands of civilians, attempting to flee toward government buildings, rumored to have water, shelter, maybe even safety. But the streets were chaos fires raging, bodies lying untended, soldiers shouting contradictory orders. As they passed a ruined bakery, Erich heard an SS officer yelling at a group of Volkssturm defenders, "Hold your ground, fight to the last bullet. Anyone who retreats will be shot as a traitor." The defenders' boys like Eric, old men leaning on rifles, wounded soldiers with makeshift bandages, nodded numbly. Some were crying. All were terrified. Eric's mother pulled him away. "Don't look," she whispered. "Just keep going." But Eric did look, and something inside him cracked. Soviet headquarters at Tempelhof. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konev studied a massive map spread over a makeshift table inside the captured Tempelhof airport. The room smelled of dust and cordite. Intelligence officers moved hurriedly around him. "Zhukov has entered from the east," Konev said. "We strike from the south, Rokossovsky from the north. Berlin will be carved apart, street by street. Casualties will be heavy," an aide noted. Konev nodded grimly. He knew. Everyone knew. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a bunker, a labyrinth, a final trap. But it had to fall. For Leningrad, for Stalingrad, for the millions dead in the ashes of the East. The battle for the bridges. By evening, Soviet troops reached the Spree River. Berlin's bridges were key routes into the government quarter. Every one was rigged for demolition. As Alexei's battalion reached the Moltke Bridge, German engineers detonated half of it. A massive chunk collapsed into the river, sending water spraying into the air. Machine gun fire rained from government buildings on the opposite bank. "Tanks forward!" Kirov yelled. A battered T-34 rolled onto the remaining span. The bridge groaned under its weight but held. Shells slammed into the stonework around it. Soviet infantry threw smoke grenades. The world turned white. Alexei and his comrades sprinted across, coughing, blinded, bullets whipping past them. He stumbled onto the far side, ears ringing. Ahead, the hulking black silhouette of the Reichstag loomed through smoke, lit by fires like a temple of death. They were close now, very close, in the Führer bunker. As explosions shook the ground above, Hitler sat in his dimly lit command room, hands trembling uncontrollably. Maps, once symbols of Nazi ambition, were now grotesque reminders of collapse. His officers pleaded for civilians to be allowed to flee south. Hitler slammed his fist onto the table. "No, Berlin must be defended to the last man. I will not abandon the capital." In the hallway, servants exchanged glances of horror. The end was certain. The only question was how many more would die before it arrived. Chapter 4. The Reichstag, Fortress of a Dying Empire. The Reichstag, once a proud monument of German democracy, now stood as the Reich's last fortress. Its massive stone columns were blackened by flames, its dome cracked open like an ancient skull. Soviet soldiers called it the lair of the fascist beast. For the Germans trapped inside, it was the final symbol worth dying for. April 28, 1945. The outer defense line. Alexei Morozov crouched behind the twisted remains of a tram line as bullets tore through the air like swarms of angry insects. The Reichstag loomed just 300 meters ahead, surrounded by trenches, barricades, barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, even repurposed tramcars welded into defensive walls. The Germans had transformed it into a fortress unlike anything Alexei had ever seen. Captain Kirov surveyed the chaos. "This is it, Alexei. Once we take the Reichstag, the war in Europe is finished." Alexei swallowed hard. Finished. A word he had not dared to imagine for years. A word that felt unreal after so much death. A shell exploded nearby, sending dust and stone flying. Soviet tanks rolled forward, cannons pounding the German defensive line. MG-42 machine guns responded, their terrifying roar slicing through Soviet infantry. A runner reached Kirov, panting. "Comrade Captain, the 150th Rifle Division is pushing from the north. We're converging on the main entrance." Kirov nodded. "Good. Tell them. No retreat. Today, we take that building, or we die in front of it." Inside, the Reichstag Corporal Heinrich Breuer, a 19-year-old defender of Berlin, knelt behind a sandbag wall inside the Reichstag lobby. He clutched his rifle, knuckles white. His ears rang from constant explosions. Dust rained from the ceiling. Smoke stung his eyes. He wasn't SS. He wasn't a fanatic. He was simply a boy who had been told he was defending Germany itself. Beside him, an SS officer barked orders. "Hold the line. Every floor, every room, every hallway. If the Soviets take the Reichstag, the Führer's plans are lost." But everyone knew the truth. Rumors had already spread. Hitler was collapsing, ranting, blaming everyone. Some whispered he was preparing to take his own life. Heinrich felt the weight of that possibility. What were they dying for now if even the Führer had given up? An explosion rocked the building. Stones showered from the ceiling. A soldier screamed for a medic. Heinrich steadied his breathing. He didn't want to die. But he also couldn't run, not with SS officers watching every movement like vultures. Then the sound came, the Soviet battle cry. URAAAA. The walls trembled. The final assault had begun. The charge. Across Königplatz outside, Alexei and his battalion surged across the wide-open square leading to the Reichstag. The ground was torn apart by craters. Smoke hung thick as fog. The air tasted like metal. Machine gun fire raked the square. Mortars exploded. Men fell everywhere. Alexei sprinted behind a destroyed statue, chest heaving. He saw comrades charging forward only to collapse seconds later, bodies crumpling like dolls. Kirov roared, "Forward, men! Forward! Don't stop now!" A T-34 barreled ahead, firing at the fortified steps. A German Panzerfaust streaked from the doorway, slamming into the tank's side. The explosion flipped the T-34 onto its turret, flames bursting from the hatch. The blast knocked Alexei flat. Dust filled his lungs. His ears rang violently. He stood shakily, wiping blood from his forehead. There it was. The Reichstag steps just meters away. If he could reach them alive, the battle for Berlin would enter its final act. Inside the residential districts. Meanwhile, in the ruins several blocks away, Erich Vogel and his mother huddled inside a collapsed cellar with dozens of terrified civilians. The air was stale. Water was scarce. Food had run out days ago. Above them, the thunder of battle grew deafening. A woman whispered, "The Soviets are at the Reichstag. It will be over soon." Another man shook his head, "Or it will get even worse." Erich pressed his hands to his ears as another explosion shook the ground. "Mother," he said weakly, "I don't want to die." She pulled him close, tears streaming. "You won't, I swear it. We will survive this." But no one in that cellar knew if survival was even possible anymore. The breach. By late afternoon, Soviet engineers reached the Reichstag wall. They planted explosives around a sealed ground floor window. Alexei and the others pressed flat against the stone as the charges blew. Kai, boom. A hole blasted open in the wall. "Soviets, inside!" someone shouted. Alexei followed the assault team into the dark, smoke-filled interior. Rubble lined the hallways. Bullet holes peppered the walls. The smell of burning fuel and plaster filled the air. German defenders opened fire from upstairs balconies. Grenades bounced down the stairs. The shooting became deafening inside the stone corridors. Alexei fired blindly toward the flashes of gunfire. Screams echoed across the marble halls. Every hallway became a battlefield. Every doorway, a choke point. Every stairwell, a killing zone. The Reichstag was becoming a tomb. Hitler's final hours. Deep underground in the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler received news that sealed his fate. The Soviets were inside the Reichstag. He stood silently for several seconds, his face gray, eyes empty. Then he said, "It is over." Those 3 words traveled through the bunker like a cold wind. The dictator of Europe, the architect of the war, retreated into his private room with Eva Braun. Hours later, a gunshot echoed through the concrete passages. Above them, Berlin continued to burn. Chapter 5. The Flag. Over the Reichstag. The battle inside the Reichstag raged like a storm trapped within stone walls. Every room became a furnace of gunfire, grenades, screams, and dust clouds so thick that men could barely see each other. The Soviets advanced floor by floor, meter by meter, fighting for each stretch of hallway as if it were the entire war condensed into one building. The marble inferno, Alexei Morozov pressed himself against a shattered marble pillar as bullets chipped away at the stone around him. The once grand interior red carpets, gilded railings, high ceilings, was now a nightmarish labyrinth of smoke and debris. "Alexei, move left," Captain Kirov shouted. Alexei jumped forward, sliding behind a toppled statue. A grenade exploded where he had been just seconds earlier. The Germans fought like cornered animals, some fanatics, some simply terrified young men like Heinrich Breuer. Many defenders retreated into the upper floors, determined to hold them as long as possible. Kirov yelled above the chaos, Find the stairwell. We need to reach the roof before nightfall. The roof. Everyone knew what it meant. Whoever controlled the roof controlled the symbol of victory. Heinrich's last stand on the second floor. Heinrich Brewer crouched behind an overturned table, firing his rifle at shadows moving through the dust clouds. MG-42 bursts rattled the ceiling. Grenades rolled across the floor, forcing him to duck again and again. Next to him lay the body of his best friend, Lucas, a bullet wound through his chest. Heinrich had tried to drag him to cover, but Lucas had died before he reached safety. Heinrich's hands shook as he reloaded. He wasn't fighting for Hitler anymore. He wasn't fighting for the Reich. He was fighting because he had no choice. If he surrendered, the SS might shoot him. If he ran, the Soviets would shoot him. If he stayed, he would probably die. A sudden shout came from behind. "Fall back to the dome. Fall back." Heinrich hesitated, then ran with the survivors toward the spiral staircase leading to the upper levels. As he climbed, he whispered a prayer he had never spoken before. "Please, let this end." The race to the roof. Alexei's squad reached the grand staircase, now blown in half by explosives. Smoke poured upward like volcanic ash. A Soviet engineer team had laid down planks and debris to create a makeshift path. "Go!" Kirov ordered. "Fast." Alexei scrambled up the improvised bridge, heart pounding. Every step felt like it would collapse beneath him. Gunshots echoed from the upper floors. The smell of burning wood and plaster burned his lungs. On the third floor, they found bodies. Soviet and German lying together, as if the war had decided to mix its dead indiscriminately. Alexei could see daylight filtering through cracks in a broken dome. They were close. But German defenders regrouped near the final stairwell. A furious firefight erupted. Bullets sparked off steel banisters. Grenades exploded with deafening bangs. Alexei fired until his rifle clicked empty. He ducked behind a column to reload. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Years of war pressed down on his shoulders. A Soviet sergeant shouted, "We need to break through now. 2nd Battalion is pushing from the north. They're close." Captain Kirov lifted his submachine gun and roared, "Forward, for the Red Army." The Soviets surged onward. The dome, the last defenders. Heinrich reached the top floor, gasping for breath. The dome above was cracked open to the sky, letting in a faint gray light through the smoke. He could hear footsteps below, Soviet troops climbing. An SS officer stood waiting with a pistol. "You boys will hold this room," he said coldly. "Anyone who retreats will be shot." Heinrich stared at the officer. He was younger than Heinrich by maybe a year, yet the madness in his eyes made him look ancient. Heinrich suddenly understood. The officer wasn't planning to survive this either. He intended to die here, and he expected everyone else to do the same. A sense of calm washed over Heinrich. He lowered his rifle. "No more," he said quietly. The SS officer turned sharply. "What did you say?" "I said no more. I won't die for a ghost." The officer's pistol rose slowly, but before he could fire, the door behind them exploded inward. Soviet soldiers stormed the dome. The room erupted into chaos gunfire, shouts, smoke. Heinrich dove behind a fallen beam as bullets tore into the walls around him. He didn't know if he would survive the next minute. He didn't care anymore. He just wanted to live. The flag. At 10:05 p.m., as the sky over Berlin flickered with firelight, Alexei burst through the final doorway onto the Reichstag roof. The wind hit him like a wave, cold, sharp, carrying the smell of ash and smoke. Fires burned across the city as far as the eye could see. Berlin glowed with the light of its own destruction. On the rooftop, scattered gunfire still echoed. Soviet and German soldiers grappled among the rubble. Captain Kirov shot down a retreating defender before turning toward Alexei. "Morozov, the flag." Alexei looked down at the bundle wrapped around his chest, the red banner, hastily sewn, symbol of victory for the entire front. His hands trembled. This moment, this small piece of cloth meant the end of the greatest war the world had ever seen. He sprinted across the roof as bullets snapped past him. A German defender rose from behind a chimney. Alexei fired first. He climbed onto the highest point of the dome, half collapsed, barely stable. The city roared below him. The flames danced in the wind. The world seemed to hold its breath. With a final burst of strength, Alexei drove the base of the red flag into the broken stone. The banner unfurled, bright, red, triumphant. It whipped wildly in the wind, illuminated by fire and artillery flashes. The Soviet soldiers below screamed with joy, cheers. Shouts, cries of disbelief. Even Kirov, hardened by years of war, wiped his eyes. Alexei stared at the flag fluttering above the dying capital. "It's over," he whispered. But he was wrong. The fighting wasn't fully over. Not yet. Night fell over Berlin, and the final chapter had only just begun. Chapter 6, The Last Night of Berlin, April 30th, 1945. Night descended like a heavy curtain over a city that no longer resembled a place where people had once lived. Streets were oceans of rubble. Buildings were torn open like wounds. Firestorms painted the sky orange and red, casting monstrous shadows across what remained of the capital. But despite the flag now flying above the Reichstag, the battle for Berlin was not yet over. Pockets of resistance still fought on, some out of desperation, others out of fanatic loyalty, and many simply because they were trapped with no way out. The streets after dusk. Alexei Morozov trudged through a devastated street leading toward the Tiergarten. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with soot, his hands shaking from exhaustion. The adrenaline of the flag-raising had faded, replaced by the grim reality of war's final, cruel hours. Captain Kirov walked beside him, limping slightly from a graze to the leg. "Well done today, Alexei. The banner is up. The world will remember what our front did." Alexei nodded, though his eyes were distant. "I thought I would feel something," he admitted. Relief. Relief that it's over. Kirov exhaled slowly. It isn't over. A trapped animal fights hardest when it knows it has nowhere left to run. Berlin is that animal now. Gunfire crackled from a nearby intersection. Soviet soldiers crouched behind the wreck of a trolley car, while German defenders fired from inside a blown-out cafe. Kirov raised his hand. "Stay back. Let the others handle it. We've done our part today." But Alexei found himself watching the battle. The Germans were still boys, still teenagers, still terrified. He wondered how many lives would be claimed in the final hours of a war already decided. Inside the Führer bunker deep below the ruined city, a silence had fallen over the concrete labyrinth. The air was cold. The smell of smoke filtered in from vents. Officers moved like ghosts through hallways now devoid of purpose. Hitler was dead. His body had been burned in the courtyard above, but the flames couldn't erase the years of destruction he had unleashed. Rumor spread quickly. Some cried. Some stared blankly. Some collapsed. General Krebs, pale and sleepless, muttered, "All this for nothing." Others whispered about surrender, but SS loyalists still roamed the corridor, determined to fight on despite the futility. Orders were contradictory. Morale was shattered. A secretary whispered to another, "The Soviets will be here by dawn." Everyone sensed it. The bunker had become a tomb. Erich in the darkness. In their cramped cellar, Erich Vogel clutched his mother's hand as the night trembled with distant explosions. Their candles had burned out hours ago. The dark felt alive, full of unseen terrors. A faint rumbling came from overhead. Footsteps, voices, gunshots. Erich tensed. "Soviets? Maybe," his mother whispered. "Or German troops retreating." Or, she couldn't finish the sentence. A baby cried in a corner. An elderly man tried to calm it. Another shell exploded nearby, showering dust from the cellar ceiling. Erich pressed his forehead to his mother's shoulder. "I want this to stop." She kissed his hair. "It will, my love. Dawn always comes." But in Berlin, dawn felt like a myth. The last counterattack. Around midnight, German command attempted one final, doomed counterattack. SS troops and a scattering of desperate Wehrmacht soldiers surged from the ruins near Brandenburg Gate, firing wildly as they tried to break out of the Soviet encirclement. Alexei was jolted awake by the sound of trucks roaring and shouts echoing down the street. Kirov burst into the building where his men rested. "Comrades, to arms! The fascists are launching a breakout attempt." Alexei grabbed his rifle, stumbling onto the street as tracer fire lit up the night like angry comets. German troops sprinted through the smoke, firing Panzerfausts at Soviet armor. A T-34 ignited into a fireball, illuminating the battle in a wash of orange light. Soviet infantry opened fire from behind barricades. Alexei dove behind a collapsed wall, firing at figures running through the haze. One of the German attackers staggered into view. Heinrich Breuer. He was running with the others, not out of fanaticism but out of pure terror. Desperate to escape the doomed city, he tripped on broken pavement and fell hard. A Soviet spotlight snapped on, bathing him in harsh white light. "Don't shoot!" Heinrich cried in broken Russian. "Don't! Please!" Alexei had a clear shot. His finger tightened on the trigger, then stopped. The boy was unarmed, dirty, bleeding, terrified. Alexei lowered his rifle. Another Soviet soldier ran past him, shouting, "Take prisoners! Don't waste ammunition!" Moments later, the breakout attempt collapsed. The Germans scattered, many surrendering, others shot or captured. The last organized resistance outside the government district was gone. Kirov approached Alexei, breathing heavily. "You should have fired. He was the enemy." Alexei wiped sweat from his brow. "He was just a boy." Kirov studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "The war ends tonight or tomorrow," he said quietly. "Maybe mercy matters now." For the first time in years, Alexei saw something human in his commander's eyes. A city holding its breath. As the final hours of April faded into May, Berlin felt eerily quiet. The guns slowed. The artillery faded. The night air held a stillness that felt unnatural after so many weeks of chaos. In the distance, the Reichstag flag fluttered in the faint wind, silhouetted against the burning horizon. It was the last night of the war in Europe. All that remained was surrender or annihilation. Chapter 12. The Diehards. Berlin's once majestic government quarter had become a maze of shattered stone and drifting smoke. Soviet snipers perched atop the ruins of ministries that had once dictated terror across Europe. Now, that terror had collapsed into dust. Inside the twisted shell of the Reich Chancellery's gardens, the last SS units dug in among the rubble, preparing for the inevitable. These were not ordinary soldiers. Many were teenagers with faces too young for the horrors they had already witnessed. Others were veterans, men who had fought across continents, now reduced to defending a wasteland. They knew the war was lost. They knew the Soviets were unstoppable. Yet they fought on, not for victory, but because there was nowhere left to run. Artillery carved the air again, and Soviet infantry pushed closer. A flamethrower burst erupted like a demonic roar, flushing defenders from a crater. The young SS officer leading the group, Untersturmführer Keller, pressed his back against a broken wall, breathing hard as dust rained over him. A boy, maybe 16, crawled to his side, trembling. "Sir, should we fall back?" Keller looked across the broken landscape. There was no back, only ruins and the tightening circle of the Soviet army. "No," he replied quietly, "we hold. As long as we can." The boy nodded, wiping soot from his face. Even in defeat, they clung to orders like a lifeline. Chapter 13. The race to the Reichstag for the Soviets. The Reichstag, the symbolic core of Nazi power, was more than just a building. It was a trophy. The moment the hammer and sickle flag flew over it, the world would know the Third Reich was finished. Thus began a brutal contest. Marshal Zhukov launched wave after wave toward the Reichstag, only to find that the open plaza before it, once a broad ceremonial field, had become a killing ground. German artillery hidden behind barricaded ruins raked the Soviets with fire. Machine guns spat from shattered windows, turning every step forward into a sacrifice. Captain Anatoly Sokolov clutched his PPS-41 and dashed behind a fallen statue of a winged goddess. His squad followed, bullets cracking the stone around them. "Captain," shouted Corporal Misha, pointing toward the Reichstag, "we're close, maybe 50 meters." Sokolov nodded. 50 meters, he said, voice steady despite the carnage. "But it may as well be 50 kilometers if we stay pinned here." He peeked over the statue's broken arm. The plaza was a wasteland of corpses, smoldering craters, and shattered concrete. Above it all, the Reichstag loomed like a fortress risen from hell. "On my signal," he ordered, "we make a push." Misha swallowed. "Eh? Push?" "Sir, with respect." "We've come too far for hesitation," Sokolov said. "This ends here." Explosions thundered behind them. Another wave of Soviet tanks rumbled forward, their armor glowing red from constant shelling. As one tank erupted in flames, the ground shook beneath their boots. Sokolov raised his fist. "Geo!" His men surged forward. Bullets tore the air like steel rain. Mortars exploded. Bodies fell. But step by agonizing step, the Soviets closed the final distance toward the building that had fueled the war. Chapter 14. Inside the Verheerbunker. Beneath Berlin, two worlds existed, the world above, collapsing into fire, and the cold, air-stale labyrinth below where the last remnants of Nazi leadership clung to denial. The Führer bunker stank of sweat, fear, and burnt electrical wiring. The hallways pulsed with hurried footsteps and whispered arguments. Maps covered the walls, but none mattered anymore. The armies they represented were imaginary. Adolf Hitler sat at his desk, trembling uncontrollably. His hands, once used to command millions, now scribbled nonsensical orders for divisions that no longer existed. Every few minutes he asked the same questions. Steiner's counterattack? Has it begun? Where are Wink's forces? But no answers came. Only silence, then excuses, then truth crushed beneath the weight of advancing reality. Outside his room, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann argued viciously. "We must negotiate," Goebbels snarled. "With whom?" Bormann shot back. "Berlin is gone. There is no Reich left to negotiate for." Eva Braun passed through the corridor, her face ghostly pale but her smile unwavering. Forced, brittle. She carried a tray of coffee to Hitler's office. "Let him have at least this," she murmured. A distant boom shook dust from the ceiling. The Soviets were already inside the government quarter. Time was running out. Chapter 15. The Flag Above a Dying Empire. The battle for the Reichstag had devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat. Grenades echoed through the corridors like thunder trapped in a tomb. Soviet soldiers fought room to room, step by step, against the fanatic defenders inside. The stairwells were slick with blood. A Soviet sergeant shoved open a door and was immediately tackled by a German officer wielding a combat knife. They crashed to the ground, rolling through debris until the sergeant fired a shot that ended the struggle. Breathing hard, he stood. "KEP moving!" he shouted. Up another flight of stairs, past burning portraits of Reich officials, past bullet-riddled railings, past the last defenders who had given everything. Finally, they reached the roof access door. Captain Sokolov, coughing from dust and smoke, climbed the final steps. Misha followed behind, clutching the ceremonial victory banner assigned to their regiment. A single German machine gunner stood between them and the rooftop. The defender fired wildly, tears running down his soot-blackened face. Sokolov dropped him with a clean shot. Silence fell. They pushed open the rooftop door. Cold wind swept across the shattered skyline. Berlin burned in every direction, crimson flames swirling into smoke that stretched into the heavens. Misha raised the banner, hands shaking. "Go on," Sokolov whispered. Together they climbed the last stretch of rubble leading to the highest point of the roof. Tracer fire whizzed past. A sniper's bullet grazed Misha's helmet, but he pressed on. At last, they planted the Soviet flag atop the Reichstag. The red banner unfurled in the wind brilliant against the smoke-choked sky, a symbol, a proclamation. The Third Reich was dead. Chapter 16. The End of the Nightmare. While the flag waves triumphantly, the nightmare beneath the city reached its final moments. Hitler gathered his remaining followers. His orders were quiet, almost tired. "All of you may leave now." Few did. Eva Braun took his hand. She whispered something, soft, gentle, meant only for him. At 30/30/1945, they retreated into a private room in the bunker. Minutes later, a gunshot cracked through the silence. The war in Europe had entered its final heartbeat. Chapter 17. After the storm. When Soviet soldiers reached the bunker, the world above had already begun to quiet. Fires still burned. Artillery still echoed. But Berlin's roar had dulled into a low, defeated groan. Captain Sokolov stood outside the Reichstag, exhausted, uniform torn, face streaked with grime. He watched civilians emerge from the ruins. Elderly men, women clutching infants, children covered in dust. War spares no one. A young German girl, barefoot and trembling, approached him. For a moment, he froze, unsure what to expect. She extended a small white flower, a symbol of surrender, or hope. Sokolov accepted it gently. The war had taken so much from him, friends, years, innocence, yet in that moment, he felt something strange, something unfamiliar, the beginning of peace. Chapter Exit. The world begins again. On May 8, 1945, the guns fell silent. Germany surrendered. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, Moscow, and New York. Tears flowed, flags waved, bells rang. A world ravaged by darkness finally stumbled back toward the light. But Berlin was silent. Its streets were graves, its buildings tombs. And yet, beneath the ashes, life remained. Mothers held their children. Soldiers shared rations with civilians. Old men swept rubble from doorsteps that no longer existed. Rebirth always begins in ruin. A city, remembered years later, a Berlin rebuilt from ashes stood as a testament to endurance. Streets flourished where tanks once rolled. Children played in parks that had once been battlefields. And atop the restored Reichstag, the flags of a united democratic Germany flew in the wind symbols of lessons learned at unimaginable cost. But history does not forget. The fall of Berlin was not merely a military victory or political turning point. It was the final convulsion of a war that consumed continents. A reminder of humanity's capacity for destruction and also for rebuilding. The red banner atop the Reichstag, the silence in the bunker, the civilians crawling from ruins, these images remain etched into the soul of the world. For though empires fall, though tyrants perish, though cities burn, memory endures. And from memory, a wiser world is born.